Black has meant many things over time, but I think we're seeing it emerge in this day and age as an important unifying rallying cry for us to resist this historical oppression that we've experienced.
Black people for so long weren't allowed to name ourselves. Labels were thrust upon us. Even our own given names were thrust upon us. So I think at the end of the day, Black people should be allowed to define themselves and call themselves what they want to.
Naming in and of itself, I think, has to be understood as a matter of power and representation. There has never been a moment in the history of the United States in which racial terms have not been somehow fraught, right?
There has been a discussion about capitalizing being Black for a very long time. And Black people had been saying for a while, this is how Black people identify, and you guys don't identify them properly. So they are trying to rectify wrongs, and capitalizing the being Black was a very low-hanging fruit that they immediately took, and I'm happy that they did.
Lori, so many American news outlets, AP, LA Times, NBC, have over the past few months announced that they will be capitalizing Black, making it an uppercase B. This isn't a recent debate though, is it? 6 years ago, you wrote an opinion piece for the New York Times making the case for exactly this. Can you explain what the debate is here?
Sure. I don't really think of it as a debate in terms of what these words actually mean. Lowercase b Black is a color. Capital B refers to a group of people whose ancestors come from the African continent. To me, it's a very simple difference. One is a color, one is a group of people.
So there's no significance to the capital B beyond that? It's literally the distinction between a color and a people?
This is why this debate, this question is both so simple and yet so meaningful. This question of whether or not you're going to capitalize the Black when you refer to Black people is a sign of respect. It's saying, I recognize you as a distinct group of people and you're beyond a color. Right? That you have a culture. I see the culture. I respect the culture. I respect you as a human being worthy of the same level of respect as any other culture.
I want to pick up on that notion of culture, Black culture. How do you arrive at a unified culture for a people who are so diverse? Is there a consensus on what constitutes Blackness?
Well, I think it's going to be impossible to come with a unified consensus, right? Because there are many different ways of experiencing Blackness. There is internal diversity within our community. But that doesn't stop us from talking about a set of shared history and a set of shared experience. So that even if I think of myself as having a unique Black experience, I'm still exposed to the same external system that has treated African Americans in a way that marginalizes us and that keeps us from accessing the fullness of our rights as citizens and our full humanity.
With the Black Lives Matter movement, there appears to be a renaissance of the term Black, whereas before African American was more widely used. So what's changed, Matthew? What's brought Black back into such widespread use?
So racial terms are incredibly slippery, let's call them. That is, they never have one precise definition or application. And when we think about the racial category of quote unquote Black, there are many synonyms that have been used. The meanings of these terms vary quite a bit and depends how and where we're using them.
Black is a term that's been around in American society since the beginning of this country, but it's a term that historically signified a kind of dehumanization of this group of enslaved Africans who were brought to the United States. We see a radical shift happening with that term in the 1960s. So we see the Black Power movement arguing for a reclaiming of that term, turning that into a rallying cry for people to think about self-determination, to think about how we can reclaim and rename ourselves and have power over the label that's used for us.
This word Black refers to a racial group, but race itself is a really hotly contested concept, isn't it?
A layperson, I think, understanding of race and ethnicity would be believing that there are biological, easily identifiable characteristics that one can see. But sociologists, anthropologists, biologists Geneticists and genomicists are now all on the same page, that race actually doesn't have any biological existence. That is, when we look for racial types by bone, we cannot find them. When we look for them by blood type, we cannot find them. Race is a biological fiction with a social function, right? It plays a role and helps us identify and sort people.
So, okay, to state the obvious then, Laurie, if we're going to capitalize the B of black, then why don't we capitalize the W of white?
I understand the question, I understand the conversation, but I do not think that the answer is what's good for the blacks is good for the whites. Not in this scenario at all. White people have never wanted to be treated the same way as black people, ever. White people have never said, what you're doing to the blacks, do it to us too. Never. The other thing is that white supremacists are very actively use the capital W to identify their white supremacist culture. So that adds a bit of a question mark also whether or not you want to adopt this capital W when it does mean something. It means white supremacist.
I want to understand how this campaign for the capital B worked within news organizations, ERIN. For example, at your paper, the LA Times, during the anti-racism protests, there was a lot more being discussed than just a capital B, am I right?
When the protest around George Floyd took off, there was concern with how media was covering it and how they were covering Black people in general. To us, the coverage was tied to there not being any Black people in the room to say that photo selection is terrible, the caption selection is terrible, the whole premise of this story is racist. We all thought it was important to have this discussion in the open. That conversation is what sparked the larger conversation that we're having now on its treatment of Black staffers and the way in which it covers Black people. From that, management decided to capitalize the B in Black to rectify a big wrong in a small, meaningful way.
So it must be a big relief to managers of American media outlets that the deep systemic changes that are needed, diversity in newsrooms, the representation of Black people in coverage, all of that can wait a bit because, after all, they've gone and capitalized the B.
Yeah, I had to admit that I laughed when I saw this question because it's absolutely the experience of many Black Americans today that we're asking for incredibly deep systemic change, and it seems like we're getting surface level responses. Now, that's not to trivialize the importance of capitalizing that B. That B does important symbolic work, but we also want to see the rest of the work being done.
For US media to really address race and racism in a critical, truthful, empirically driven way would be to study, for example, the diffusion of anti-Black ideologies in the United States and how they come to function in our institutions, how they structure and guide our interactions, from who we marry to where we live to how long we live. If media could interrogate those in an honest way to admit that white supremacy is still quite normative and that anti-Blackness is a still quite normative way of making sense of the world, then we would have completely different storytelling about our local communities, our states, and the nation writ large.